Thank you very much, Deborah. I'm delighted to be in York again. I have visited York from time to time over the years, rightly so, because York has a very long and distinguished tradition in languages education, dating right back to the early years of the university and the Language Teaching Centre, when the team led by Professor Eric Hawkins and his colleagues were very instrumental in promoting and developing the teaching of languages for all at all levels of the new comprehensive school system. So York has a very honourable tradition in this field, and it's really great to see how this tradition is being renewed and carried on today by such outstanding scholars as Emma. I knew Emma first at Southampton, where she did her postgraduate studies. Her academic ability struck us immediately, but also her independence of thinking, against my advice a bit. Emma did a very ambitious PhD project, a classroom experiment. I was worried, can she do it? Will she get meaningful results with a tricky research design? But of course, Emma being Emma, the study was meticulously carried out and very successful, did indeed produce interpretable results, and in fact led swiftly to one of Emma's very first academic publications in one of the most eminent journals there is in our field, that is to say the journal Language Learning, which I'm happy to say Emma is of course now the incoming editor. She's the incoming editor for that journal starting this year. So Southampton started her off on a train of research which Emma has actually stuck to in her personal research. She's very concerned with and interested in the learning of grammar in a second language, particularly among classroom learners. How do classroom learners figure out the different grammar, the new grammar that they're hearing in the foreign language input around them? And not least, what kinds of teaching practices can support them in extracting grammar out of that input? Now, this is both a fundamental question in second language acquisition research, but also, of course, it has great practical implications for language pedagogy. And Emma has pursued that different aspects of that problem, of that question, with great persistence and originality ever since that time. But she hasn't been content just to be one of those very focused researchers that Paul and myself were speaking about before the meeting, because Emma also, well, I'd like to think Southampton again played a small part in this. When at Southampton, Emma joined in our research projects, we were very interested in at that time in data sharing. How could we make the data we had collected about early language learning available to other researchers to use? Well, Emma took that idea of openness, connected it up with the broader open science movement that's current in many disciplines now, and has been a great advocate of open science, of transparency, and of their merits in driving up standards in language learning research and in applied linguistics research ever since. She has initiated a major project which has forwarded that goal, the IRIS project, which allows researchers to contribute the questionnaires they've written, the language tests they've written, all the instruments they have created to study language learning. We can now deposit those in this IRIS repository, managed, invented, thought up, created, and managed by Emma, and researchers can access and share those instruments. And again, you see the principle of openness and sharing, which must improve standards across and common understandings of the problems we're working on in our discipline. So she also has clearly a major commitment to education, and we're going to hear more about this bridging the gap from Emma herself this afternoon. So I'll quickly mention just two things. One is her wish to make research publications, published research, available to wider publics and in particular to teachers. And another of Emma's great projects, again with good funding secured to support it, is the OASIS project, which allows, which is now supported by many major publishing outlets and journals in our field. where authors produce, as well as their academic article with long words and lots of tables and hidden behind paywalls, as well as those, we now are expected to write plain language summaries of our research, which the journals have agreed will be made publicly available through the OASIS project. Finally, Emma, of course, has played a major key role and a developing role in government advice, in advising DFEE on research-based practices in foreign language education, and this has culminated now in the major Centre for Excellence in Modern Foreign Language Pedagogy, the flagship DFE project in foreign language education at the moment in the country, which is led by Emma and located here in York. So congratulations on all of this, contributions to the international field of second language acquisition research and language learning research, but also to UK policy and practice and the commitment to bridging the gap between research and practice, which we're going to hear more about. I could say a lot of nice personal things about Emma, but I think it's more important that she gets the time, so I'll stop there.
Thank you so much. I hope to live up to that now. Thank you so much for coming. Thank you for the warm words, and thank you for the fantastic beginning I had in Southampton. So, in 1976, when I was 4 and I began school, Prime Minister Callaghan was talking about one core national school curriculum, eventually implemented in 1988. And this caused a sensation because up until that moment, government had not really meddled with, influenced to a great extent, the school curriculum. In 1988, I was in the first cohort of GCSEs, which eliminated a formalised distinction between O-level exams, which for foreign languages had privileged translation and grammar, and the CSE exam, which had included tests in listening and speaking. In 1992, language study was made obligatory for all children aged 11 to 13. When I became head of Spanish in a school in 1996, a foreign language became compulsory up until the age of 16. And at one point, up to 80% of pupils nationally were entered for a modern foreign language GCSE. And this national policy lasted for 8 years. In 2015, my youngest daughter entered the cohort of primary school children for whom language was compulsory for the first time in England. In 2016, I provided evidence for a national report on foreign language pedagogy in England, and my eldest daughter started a new kind of GCSE that reintroduced translation and grammar in the tests. In 2018, a few months after I'd heard I was going to be made a professor, the government announced their intention to invest in foreign language pedagogy, and this was awarded to York in December last year. And now, here I am, giving an inaugural lecture on education in the main European languages in an era of uncertain times with Europe. The point being, my journey in foreign language education has been punctuated by our mixed attempts to open up more people to foreign languages, trade and cultures. I now find myself in a position to shape one of these turning points, and I'm immensely grateful to York, to my colleagues, students, friends and family for supporting this. I'm using this talk as an opportunity to situate my research within this wider picture. First, I will describe the problems that I've tried to address, and then present 2 examples of the kinds of studies I've done, and then finally describe how these are playing out in the National Centre for Excellence for Language Pedagogy, NCELP for short. Okay, so this is the question I aim to address today. To what extent can my research inform foreign language pedagogy? That is, what we teach and how we teach. And how can my research inform pedagogy? And the specific problem is whether and how to teach grammar in foreign language, and particularly in the early stages, because, as Sophie is going to explain, this is most challenging because this is when learners with a very wide range of individual differences embark on a foreign language. But why is there any debate at all about whether and how to teach a foreign language grammar? First, it is extremely difficult to teach a natural human grammar with so little time available. Let me put foreign language education in England in perspective. According to some estimates, infants have about 17,500 hours of exposure to language by the age of 4. They hear between 2,000 to 15,000 words a day, and they arrive at primary school with several thousand words in their heard and spoken vocabulary, ready to link that sound system with the written word. In foreign language education, between 11 to 16 years, we give about 430 hours of instruction, possibly 80 plus 80 if you're lucky at primary school, and we can learn between 4 to 10 words in an hour of instruction. In this time, we expect a complex grammar to have developed, around 2,000 to 3,000 words to be known, and a new set of sound-spelling relations. Eric Hawkins, as we've just heard, the founder of the first language centre here at the university, described this situation as gardening in a gale. As a result, I've come to accept over my 20 or so years of teaching, researching, working with teachers and policymakers that we can rely very little on the implicit learning mechanisms that infants use. Given that, and this bit's critical, given that we have to work within the current examination system, which requires a large body of accurate language to be learnt in a short amount of time. But under these circumstances, it's not yet clear whether all learners can develop a creative grammar system. A second reason for this grammar debate is that many agree that the reason why we teach a foreign language is to, of course, express self-identity, understand culture, communicate, all of which are thought to require complex grammar. A quick way of achieving these aims has been by asking pupils to rote learn a large bank of prefabricated phrases without always helping them to unpick the components of these phrases. Third, some perspectives on language teaching have perhaps wrongly been interpreted as a need to hide a thread, a spine of vocabulary and grammar progression. And this has resulted in a strong tendency to sequence content around topics and functions, such as expressing opinions or planning one's future. A fourth reason is that findings from peer-reviewed research on grammar pedagogy have been very difficult to access for many reasons. But there are now hundreds of studies that could inform our thinking about what and how to teach grammar. Fifthly, perhaps related to this lack of access to research, is that there has been a lack of centralised policy and teacher education on grammar pedagogy. Dobson's review of the recent history of foreign language education came to the same conclusion. Many teachers tend to be uncertain about the place of grammar and its relationship to communication. Teachers' insecurity and confusion about grammar teaching led to them adopting diverse and idiosyncratic policy interpretations and practices. So, to illustrate this mix of practices that we see, I turn to Anecdote. But I think that many of you will recognise these examples in your children's school bags. This is an extract from some homework that a Year 7 child, aged 12, after about 43 hours of French teaching, brought home. Pupils were shown these two written sentences with open slots for a name and a number of years. Then they were told, "This means my best friend is called X. I have known her for Y years. Write it down and learn it with the other phrases for the test next week." Now, this is complex. We have gender agreement on possessive pronouns, a reflexive verb, a preverbal feminine object pronoun, an irregular verb ending, and a complex temporal adverb, to name but a few. Now, of course, teaching some prefabricated phrases such as these can be useful. I would like to. How old are you? This smooths the way into communication, and analytic learners with good memories can break these down and reuse the parts. But this takes time, and it's easier for some learners than others. For example, in this instance, I understand that no one asked, what would happen to the language if my best friend was a boy? Maybe one did. Let's look at a textbook. Learners have to read the text with colour that you see here, and then they answer the questions. You can pick out the answers without too much problem. When, we're asked, well, look for the word that's related to time. Samedi, Saturday. What's your favourite animal? Find animal préféré and elephant. But this unit in the textbook was actually trying to teach the past tense. And the next thing that learners had to do after this was to write a passage in the perfect tense, even though this exercise clearly does not focus their attention on that. But of course, teachers don't just rely on textbooks. Here's an extra handout about Spanish words for a, the, and some. This explanation introduces a lot. Don't try and read it. It does not explain the most important, and in my view, the loveliest pattern of all, that in Spanish, you can usually tell the gender of a noun by the ending, if it ends in o, masculine, a, feminine. Now, the next thing they had to do was to produce these articles. They didn't know what the nouns meant, and most of these are irregular. There's no way of knowing what the gender is. If an analytical learner had tried to pick out a pattern, attempts to pick out that pattern would soon be abandoned. These are irregulars. Now, looking back to when I was teaching, using very similar resources to these, I felt lost. I didn't understand why we were doing what we were doing. I had no sense of progression of the vocabulary or the grammar that we were teaching. So what did I leave teaching to do? I've embarked on a series of studies in collaboration with many wonderful students and colleagues, many of whom are here now. They have generally taken the form of small-scale controlled experiments. And here's their basic design. This is what was making Ros nervous, I think, in my PhD. Here's their basic design. So we select a predefined set of learners, and we give them some baseline tests across a battery of measures, and then we randomly allocate them to different conditions. In my case, we would randomly allocate them to attending to and understanding the grammar in the input, i.e. in listening and reading, to hearing the same grammar but do something else with the input instead, or only do the tests, a control group, and then give them post-tests immediately after the teaching, and then delayed post-tests a while afterwards. Why? Well, I wanted to know to what extent you can learn a grammar, pick up a grammar in a new language, and do something more interesting, more interesting than grammar at the same time. Just like we saw in those listening and reading activities just now. Okay, so going back to my PhD, I set out to teach a small system of French verb endings. This was for 13 to 14-year-olds in 2 secondary schools with about 28 pupils in each condition. In the first condition, pupils had repeated practice like this. You will, of course, know that this little morpheme here, a, means the action's done and complete. And without such a morpheme, this means that an action is happening now or happens regularly. So here they had to understand the grammar in order to do the activity. In the other condition, pupils were exposed to exactly the same language, but they had to do something else with the input, a bit like we saw in that French textbook example. They have to understand the meaning of other parts of the sentence, ski. Pupils in the first condition made substantial gains, in this condition on the left, made substantial gains in their verb endings, across a battery of tests. In the second condition, very few gains were made in the verb endings, then the vocabulary gains were roughly the same across both groups. Okay, the second study was about learning how to mark plurality using an artificial language so that everyone started from the same baseline. So participants heard and saw a word like ciferdot. And they had to choose which picture it matched. They were told whether they were right or wrong. Okay, so over time, you can see here that their attention was oriented towards the end of that word. They had to focus on the meaning of the ending because ek represented plurality. In the other condition, they heard exactly the same words, ciferdot, ciferdek. But in this case, over time, their attention was oriented to the meaning of the stem. Learners in this condition picked up the meanings of these stems unsurprisingly. They learnt that cipher meant climbing, but they did not pick up that grammar on the end of the words. Participants in the first condition on the left learnt that grammar system, very simple grammar system, and they also picked up the meanings of the stems. Now, this study is one of my most rarely cited studies, and it is slightly crazy. But it was fundamental for me, and looking back, I think it gave me confidence to move towards a more applied agenda. You may be asking, how does this kind of research contribute to a 2.17 million in government investment in a centre for excellence? It won't surprise you to know that my research and its associated agenda chimed with a much bigger set of external political drivers. First is the perceived language crisis in England. Declining numbers at GCSEs are influencing A-level, degrees and teacher supply. Estimates are that this situation costs the UK economy 3.5% of GDP per year. You can see that we tend to bob around about 40 to 50% of our 16-year-olds taking a language GCSE. Just 1/3 of our 16-year-olds get a good pass. And now in a third of state schools, over 50% can drop a language when they are 13. Another driver that led to this investment was the social mobility agenda. Regional inequality means that, for example, 62% of pupils in London study a GCSE, a language GCSE, 40% in the Northeast, and 29% in Middlesbrough. Socioeconomic disparity means that children taking free school meals are much less likely to study a language GCSE compared to those with less challenging socioeconomic backgrounds. The Social Mobility Plan published by the government specifically mentioned access to high-quality modern foreign languages subject teaching. A third external driver for this investment has been negative reports about the quality of MFL pedagogy. For example, in 2015, it was noted that achievement was not good enough in about half of the MFL classes observed. Whatever we think of school inspectors' methods or their impact on teachers, what I'm presenting here reflects or shows that what wider factors are necessary to lead to government investment in a specific curriculum area. The Modern Foreign Languages Pedagogy Review, the report I was involved in, also argued that poor pedagogy can affect motivation. And indeed, several research studies have documented a link between learners' sense of achievement and their sense of progression and their motivation to learn. So, the DFE invested in a new pedagogy, building on the recommendations made in the pedagogy review. And this has enabled Rachel Hawkes and me to build an amazing team. And I thank Rachel and the NSELP team, some of whom are here, others are out in schools delivering CPD, who have taken a leap of faith, albeit one informed by research, to come with me on this mission. This is the network of 45 schools with about 45,000 pupils and 219 foreign language teachers. But let's put this in perspective. This is just 1.3% of state secondary schools, a drop in the ocean. So what are we doing? Well, part of pedagogy is deciding what body of knowledge we want to teach. Models of what it is to know a language, of course, include knowledge of grammar, vocabulary, and phonics, sound symbol relations, sound writing relations, circled on the left here. In the earliest stages of language learning, our resources are foregrounding this bank of knowledge to help launch and then work in tandem with this body of knowledge, the other competencies circled on the right here. So, for example, in order to create cohesion, you can see in the right circle, you first need sentences to make cohere. My 15-year-old, in revising for her GCSEs, had about 20 phrases to learn for opposition relations, in spite of, although contrary to, on the other hand. She knew them all, but I think she would agree that the balance of things to be learnt was probably not right. It seems that our collective attention has wandered from, or we have lost confidence in, focusing on a bank of vocabulary and a basic grammatical system, and focused too much too soon on the competencies on the right. So, NSELP's mission, we've been challenged with defining this body of knowledge and then, critically, helping teachers to provide planned and meaningful practice of this body of knowledge. What you can see on the left here is a stylized characterization of observed pedagogy. And on the right, you can see the pedagogy that the DFE have funded us to develop and pilot. I'm circling here two elements that are outside my core area of expertise: phonics, the sound writing relations, and vocabulary. So as you can see, this is a far cry from those kinds of controlled experiments all about grammar that I introduced earlier. And this is why we need the large team. But also, it's why we're using academic research in a way that I think is unprecedented, at least in the UK MFL scene. We are using summaries research on the database that Ros talked about that are made available on Oasis, which is a database holding non-technical summaries of research that are openly accessible. 3 journals make it obligatory to have a summary written, and many others ask or invite their authors to write summaries. We have now about 300. So, many of the resources that are on the NSELP, the Centre for Excellence database, we've got about 200 resources so far, they are linked to summaries of the relevant research. So, of course, these summaries don't provide a direct link to those specific resources, but they do provide an opportunity to reflect on some of the evidence that we're using to inform the resource creation. So where now? Where can having one's feet in 2 camps lead? We are yet to know whether our work will address in a substantial or sustainable way the language crisis or the social mobility agenda. Let's recall that in half a century, we have moved from only about 20% of children studying a language at grammar schools at age 16 to a situation where all are entitled to do so and about 50% do. So that's about 30% more children. But this change is largely due to major policy shifts: comprehensivization in 1965, the national curriculum, and unifying the exam system. So, for our centre, NSELP, to increase GCSE uptake by 15%, which is the bar that the DFE have set us, without any macro policy changes, is challenging. Secondly, we are yet to know whether the high-stakes GCSE exams in fact work against changing approaches to teaching. The NSELP team is now in a position to shape the exams, and we are gathering evidence for this, for example, about the amount of vocabulary that's needed for the exams. Finally, my experience has shown me that there are many highly experienced practitioners who would welcome greater access to research findings, but there are still very few academic linguists who understand foreign language pedagogy and classrooms. Collaborations with teachers are, of course, essential, but simply we need more bodies who have 2 feet in 2 camps, 1 foot in 2 camps. We need more such people who have this dual expertise. Yes, I'm answering the question in the title of my talk. I've had a foot in 2 camps, and that's been necessary. And I've learnt that in order to be confident about the latest research findings, when working at this research practice interface, that maintaining a fundamental research agenda driven by learning theory now actually feels more important. And thanks to York's support and the fantastic colleagues I am privileged to work with, and the continued patience and support of family and friends, I think this is going to be just about possible. Thank you for listening.